I come from a sister Catapult, from Transport Systems Catapult. So we have a very similar mission. We advance innovation to grow UK companies and to make cities better. That's kind of our motto. And quite conveniently, our introductory slide talks about 2050. So not 50 years away, but kind of sufficiently far away for us not to know what's going to happen. It has been already mentioned that the urban population is increasing, so there are a lot of challenges: air pollution, traffic, health, etc., which is quite interesting when you're looking at the future. And what brings us here today is a big, bold question: how will intelligent mobility and innovation transport in 50 years' time? And quite honestly, I have no idea. And I'm sorry to disappoint you. That's it, no idea. I don't have it, and we don't have it at the Catapult. But what we see a lot is a lot of dreams. It doesn't take us long to find a lot of dreams being sold. This is quite a romantic and vision of the future, really. And it goes on and on and on. I'm not going to focus in particular. I have to say, I actually saw the taxi drone in Dubai last month. It does exist. I didn't see it working, but they do claim that in 2 months they will have taxis all over Dubai transporting people. Interesting conversation, I guess, to have after this. And it keeps going, the Hyperloop. Actually, it does exist. They are testing it. Whether it's an interesting solution for the future, that's also questionable. And not only from the engineering point of view, but a lot of other challenges are faced. And then we have also for London some interesting propositions and some interesting scenarios. But all of them, not criticizing, because actually we do the same. We do a lot of speculative work, and we try to understand which are the visions, which are the scenarios, and which are the propositions that we can explore. But all of them have one thing in common. We don't know if they're the solution. We don't know if cities need them. We don't know if they will address the challenges, and we don't know if people want them. So in an attempt to understand how could be the roadmap to the future, I'm here just to present what we're doing and what we do know now. So one of the projects that we have at Future Cities Catapult is the Urban Mobility Innovation Index. And despite its name, again, sorry to disappoint, it's not an index, it's a framework. And it's being done with Dubai. Dubai wanted to understand how does the ecosystem of innovation work for urban mobility. So what we did was to develop a framework to understand different policy levers and what would the ecosystem mean, and how could we identify the opportunities and the big challenges in several cities, and how could a city work better to improve its innovation ecosystem and to address the real challenges of the real city and the real users. So just to give you a very brief overview of it, we looked at 3 different dimensions. So we looked at the readiness level of a city. So the big question was, does the city have a grounded view on how to look at innovation? Second, we looked at the deployment, and more about, is the city implementing the required resources to deploy the innovation, and then livability factor, looking more at the impacts and how those innovations would have a positive or not, or a negative impact in the city. And it was quite an interesting exercise. We developed some indicators to look at the readiness level, the strategy. Does the city have a strategy or not? How does the city involve the stakeholders and the users? What kind of information is it using to ground the vision and all of the actions that are planned in the strategy? Looking at the deployment more on regulation. What kind of regulation is it blocking innovation from happening? And it's interesting because before someone was talking about regulation and how it would enable innovation. It can also block it. And a lot of the things that we see now, and whether Uber is the right solution or not, the fact is that regulation and regulatory frameworks are not ready for those kinds of disruptive innovations in cities. So we looked at that. We looked at engagement of the user, so not looking at the transport user, but the city user. Okay? And this is a very important element because it's very common in cities to look at the transport user, and we're trying to look at a broader way and in a more inclusive way, looking at other uses of the city that are usually not considered when looking at urban mobility. And in terms of livability, we're looking at seamlessness, so the connectivity of the system, the well-being, and here we took into account also fairness and equity, and then environment, more on the perspective of energy and air quality. So what we did after, we implemented it, we tested it in 30 cities worldwide with very different governance models, with very different solutions available, very different development stages. And overall, it was a very interesting exercise, but one of the questions that we had was about specifically data. And one of the questions that we tried to look at was how was data being used to inform not only the strategy, but also how was it enabling new innovations. And the findings were not that surprising, I have to say, but it's good to have this evidence that allows us then to do something about it. So overall, cities, I mean, it's common knowledge. There's a lot of data being collected. However, it is still very focused on transport-related data. And this is one of the things I would like to kind of work around and try to work with cities in terms of look at the non-conventional stakeholders that are around you. Because sometimes innovations are not in these transport stakeholders, but in a different sector that might be useful for you. Data analytics and skills are lacking, and this is something that I think was also mentioned before. Cities do lack these capabilities, so there's a major need for collaboration and for synergies in different areas. The high-performing cities that we considered, they are turning into open data models that enhance and to allow innovation to happen. So by allowing others to use that data to enable more innovative solutions. An interesting thing that we also notice is that a lot of cities have a lot of data and they're not doing anything with it. So there's the dilemma of having the thrill and the intention of instrumentalizing cities and it's very frequent to see cities putting sensors all over the place, but in fact, are those useful, and what are you doing with that data? So it's also a balance that should happen, and it's currently not being considered as it should. Just to give you, so what's about the future? We know what's the present, we identified the opportunities. The future is about data and about informed decisions and trying to understand what does the user want and how can you use that information to make better decisions. So overall, you can enable innovation if you open the data, if you make it accessible to other stakeholders. You can use it as a service and actually make business out of it. And this is one of the mobility as a service solutions that currently is one of the first in Helsinki, WIM, and they're trying to now come into the UK and develop a similar solution. So basically integration of solutions and mobility solutions and trying to make it more a flexible system and more adjusted to what users want instead of having a very rigid offer of the solutions in the city. To manage your operations more efficiently, obviously. And this is Singapore, which I think it's one of the best examples on how Singapore data is being used for the transport systems. Obviously, it also depends very much on the governance model and the fact that almost all the mobility system is controlled by one organization. It makes things much easier to manage. And then to better inform planning. And I guess that this takes me to the point of it's not only about mobility, it's about accessibility. It's about looking at the city as a whole. It's about looking at the fact that you want to ensure accessible opportunities to your users of the city. So mobility is one of the city's systems of the city and has to be looked at in a wider way, and it has to be included as a planning, one of the planning dimensions of the city. I'm going to finish with just one thought, which is quite common. I mean, I'm an engineer too, so I'm happy to see two women engineering in one panel on transport, which is very rare. But one of the things that is quite common to see in mobility and transport sessions is to look at the problem in a very logical way. but mobility is everything but logical, and people have emotional decisions that go beyond the understanding of logic and engineering. So just with a final thought in terms of, we live in a time when emotions and feelings count more than truth, and there is a vast ignorance of science. So just living there. Thank you very much.